Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Charvak podcast. This is your host, Kushal Nehra. All right, today's discussion is how to communicate risk and data better. So I'll just give you guys a background about why I decided to host today's discussion. Is a lot has been going on as far as COVID is concerned. A lot of news comes out as far as vaccines are concerned. A lot of news comes out as far as infections are concerned, as far as transmission is concerned. But we don't know what to make sense out of this the stream of information that is bombarded to us on a daily basis. And then Ram and I were having a conversation offline, and I was like, Ram, this is really frustrating. I'm sick and tired of the way people are communicating and interpreting data. So I think it's time you come on the podcast and enlighten all of us, because this is kind of what you do all the time. Your background is in behavioral science, and you've been involved in it. And we anyways discussed a lot of this in the previous podcast, and Ram was kind enough to say, okay, I'll come back on. So Ram, thanks a lot for coming again.
Yep, glad to be here.
All right, Ram. So let's lay it down. So how do you want to start it? So obviously you told me to title this "How to Communicate Risk and Data Better." So what do you think are the possible problems when we try and understand uh, any particular issue? So we'll use COVID as an analogy because it's kind of very prevalent right now. But we want to keep in mind that this is about the larger image of how do we look at. So let me start like this, right, Ram? I always use this example. So whenever we have a conversation, we say on an average men are taller than women, and then there will be that one person in the room who will come and say, but I know XYZ female who's taller than her husband. It still doesn't change the reality. So Ram, now I hand it over to you. All yours.
So I think the the probably one of the basic reasons as to why we are so bad at it is because we are not taught it properly. Uh, for Before I go into all this discussion, just a plug-in for a brilliant guy who does a lot of work in this area called Gerd Gigerenzer. He's written quite a bit. So if you think of go back to your school, right? So two of the things that we don't teach properly is how to make sense of numbers, risk, and data. We do a lot of mathematics, calculus, and so on and so forth, but basic numbers, basic statistics, how to read and how to make sense, we don't do a good job. The other thing is money and how to deal with it. And then you have, broadly speaking, two types of actors who are very good at it and therefore they manipulate it, and rest of us who are not very good at it. In fact, I would say that most, highly paid, highly educated people would be very poor at making sense of data. It's not easy. It doesn't come naturally to us. We are very good at like pattern recognition and so on and so forth. So let's take an example beyond COVID, right? So you'll see an ad or a newspaper item that says a new cancer drug that is 100% more effective, right? It sounds great, and you start thinking, man, this must be like really effective, right? But then once you start looking at not relative risks, but absolute risks, you'll find that the previous drug saved 1 in 1,000 people, and this new drug says saved 2 in 1,000 people, right? So relatively, it's not a great, I mean, it is a great drug, but absolutely, it's not a great drug. But I mean, those are the people, as they say, if you torture data, it will confess. So you can torture data in a way and kind of make it confess to whatever that you want, right? And on the other spectrum, like I said, a lot of numbers keep coming our way, and then it's difficult to kind of make sense of it. And therefore, then we start using our emotions or our heuristics to make sense. Like you said, one of the things is proximity effect, right? So what do I see, right? As opposed to what do the numbers tell me, or recency, right? What happened yesterday, as opposed to what happened a month before. And therefore, our reactions can be uh, too good in the extreme sometimes, and sometimes we don't react at all to numbers, right? Especially when the numbers are very, very large. If you tell someone, there are 100,000 cases, there are a million cases, right? These big numbers make it very, very difficult for us. In fact, the very good experiments on when they seek donations, for public causes, like say starvation in a particular country, there's not like a real difference between saying, 20,000 people are going hungry or 20 million people are going hungry, right? Beyond, there is this kind of a numbing effect.
Mhm.
And the other bit is in terms of how we make sense of percentages and so on and so forth. We never ask the question, percentage of what, right? I mean, somebody throws a number and we just look at it and say whether it is higher or lower. Now, coming to COVID, right? It's a deadly combination of a lot of things. It's a deadly combination of fear, innumeracy, poor understanding of risk, and so on and so forth. I mean, fear is a great emotion. Somebody has said, fear has saved more lives than anything else. It's
Oh,
essential.
absolutely.
Yeah, it's essential to our survival. If you see a snake, you should be fearful. But constant fear kills, right? And that's what is kind of happening. It's that if you constantly keep scaring people, that's kind of a big detriment to public health. And so therefore, when we see all these numbers, there is like I was tweeting, there is a combination of ignorance, malice, and laziness in kind of making sense of these numbers. And it can have all kinds of effects, right? So it can have effects where people take undue risk, where somebody might say, nobody around me has got COVID, and therefore I'll go and take those risks, as opposed to looking at overall, numbers. Or sometimes, you're too scared. Like we were discussing prior to the show, this entire bit about hygiene theater, right? Where we are wiping everything down, washing our hands. There was never really any evidence to do that. But if you go back to the a year ago, that was our single biggest public health measure to stop this virus. Not even masks, right?
Mm.
Before anything else, hand wash became a major thing. Apple Watch started putting a hand wash 30-second timer as a feature in it. So we overdid it, and now CDC and everyone is asking us to stop doing it, and then they communicate this number saying, the risk of catching it at like 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 35,000, which means nothing to my mind. I mean, like, uh, I was in this conference many years ago where there's this specific procedure. If you undergo, you can reduce HIV risk by 60%, right? And then my question was 60% of what, right? Is it 60% of people? Is it 60% of times, right? I mean, what is this 60%? And I was commenting that the only good thing about 60% is that it's more than 50%, right? So, so that's the only good thing about 60. And beyond that, it makes no sense, right? So, uh, I'll make this one last point, and you can discuss the next things. Is that God gives this fantastic example, right? So there is this psychiatrist treating patients, and then for many people, he prescribes a medication, and he tells them, "Hey, you know what? There is a 30% chance of impotence with this medication, right? So I just want to let you know." And he was actually quite shocked that no one stopped and asked, what should I do? And they just seemed very nonchalant about it. And then he started reframing this, saying that, hey, you know what? 3 out of 10 people who take this medication, develop impotence, right? And then everybody sat back and said, hey, tell me more. Because when you say 30%, people don't know. Is it 30% of the time I have sex? Is it 30% of the people? What is this 30%, right? It makes no sense. And therefore, we have all these things happening now, right? In terms of whether vaccine efficacy or mask efficacy and so on and so forth, where all these numbers start, kind of floating around that, undermine confidence in vaccines and, lead to a bunch of other problems, which are very, very hard to overcome. Uh, and maybe we can talk a little bit more in terms of, specific to vaccines. But that's one good example of framing risk as opposed to 30% to, 3 out of 10. It's much more tangible, kind of much more relatable. Uh, and the other thing to again bear in mind is that we have a negativity bias. Any like negative information, we tend to kind of focus too much. So that's another thing to kind of bear in mind when communicating risk, or you have to provide some context, right? Otherwise, we're always thinking about the worst case scenario.
So how about this, Ram? Before we get into a little bit more COVID stuff, I wanted to actually put that slide up that you were talking about, where
Mm.
people
Yeah,
actually tend to seek certainty. So now, can you talk about this slide that you had sent me? So,
yeah,
so what is
it's
this about?
yeah, it's a fantastic slide. It's in the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. So what you see on the x-axis is actual probability of an event, and what you see in the y-axis is that how people perceive it to be, right? So for example, if something is 1% probable, right? So which means something's like sun rises in the east, right? So there is absolutely no doubt there. So assume that there is a specific event which earlier wouldn't happen. But even if you tell someone that, hey, there is a 1% chance of something happening, in our mind, that 0 to 1 is a big shift,
Hmm.
right? Suddenly, from something that could never happen, that it could happen, and we overweight it, right? So this chart suggests that we overweight it by 5 times, right? So something that's like 1%, now that there's a 5% probability of it happening. Like think lotteries, right? So why do so many people buy lotteries? You know the probabilities. Or why do so many people gamble in a casino? You know the house always wins, but it's a combination of overconfidence that I'll win, or the numbers I pick in a lottery will win. I mean, that's a genius of lotteries where you can pick your own numbers, where somehow you
Hmm.
think you have control of the outcomes and the possibility effect, right? So suddenly from it seemed a little bit higher than what it is. And on the other extreme, you'll see this beautiful value of 100 and 99. The difference between 99 and 100 is just one. But
Hmm.
again, in our heads, when we look at 99, there is still some possibility that this may not happen, right? So therefore, we wait uh, at say 90. Now, when you see this in the context of some of these vaccines and their efficacy, and we'll come to a deeper discussion on that. Suppose a public health official says this vaccine is 80% has 80% efficacy, right? So that's the actual probability. But since it's not 100, in our heads we tend to think of it more close to 60, right, and not 80. And that's how the mind plays tricks with us. And so therefore the heuristic for 60, like I said, is 50, right? It's half. So we're thinking maybe this vaccine is half as effective, right? It seems closer to 50 than to 100, although the number 80 is much closer to 100 than it is 50, and it's a big difference, right? So
Hmm.
I think these are the things for us to kind of bear in mind when you're communicating percentages and probabilities,
Hmm.
that uh, the actual probabilities are very different from consumer or people weighted probabilities. So as a public health official, you have to be honest. So you can't obviously lie and say this is more effective than what it is. But I think when sharing numbers, it's therefore very important to then say 8 out of 10 people uh, won't get it, as opposed to saying 80%, right? So that's one way to kind of communicate it. And there are other strategies one can use, in terms of personalizing it or making it relevant to a state or to a specific district and so on and so forth. But I think it's a very, very interesting chart in terms of understanding actual probabilities versus, how we look at probabilities. Again, it's not easy for people to kind of make sense of these probabilities. In fact, most educated people would kind of get it wrong. Yep.
All right. So I have now let's get into I'll take this slide off now. So now let's get into something that I wanted to talk about. Let's focus a little bit more on the vaccine. So here's the bit about the vaccine. So I'm going to share something that really pissed me off today. No,
Mhm.
until the extent that me being me, I started swearing because that's how I am. So I'm just going to put two photos up, Ram. And
Mhm.
this is a classic case of pathetic reportage. So let's start with the first photo. Here is the first photo. This is the first photo, right? 37 doctors of Gangaram Hospital test COVID positive. Now, what they're trying to insinuate here is that these doctors got a vaccine and they got COVID. Hi Ram, mar gaye, dunya barbaad ho gayi, hum lut gaye. And then, lo and behold, the same doctor from that hospital itself tweeted this. This is
Mhm.
Dr. Sujay. He says, we are 500 doctors at Gangaram Hospital. 37 are COVID positive, which means 92.6% protection from infection. Absolute protection, right? 5 are hospitalized, most because of significant comorbidities. That is 99% protection from hospitalization. So that means if you got COVID after getting the COVID shot, and you did not have any comorbidities, you're 99% sure that you're not even going to get hospitalized. And then he says 5 admitted don't have severe disease. That means you have a 100% protection from severe disease and mortality. Now, here's a classic case, Ram, of I don't know how to say this, but an illiterate journalist who must be working in a social media cell of a big mainstream media organization that and there is now here's the problem here. I don't know. So I myself, I always believe in the Hanlon's razor, right? Never attribute to malice that which can be explained by stupidity. So I am trying to say that these people are stupid and they don't have malice, but I really don't know anymore. So if you're working in the social media cell of this particular media group, what is your job? You have to attract more and more people to your Twitter handle, more and more people, because at the end of the month, you must be giving that engagement report to your bosses. Look, my Twitter handle had this much engagement, these are my analytics. And so how do you create it at the time of COVID? You scare the living daylights out of people by showing them all these weird news that हाय कोविड वैक्सीन ले ली उसके बाद भी कोविड हो गया. But my question to you is that what do you think? Are they just stupid, or they're just doing it out of malice, as in so stupid because we have a negativity bias, we are not even aware of it, and we just want to cling on to whatever is negative? So which one do you think is the case?
I was tweeting that it's a combination of malice, ignorance, and sheer laziness. Right? I mean, journalism has a public responsibility, right? So you're first and foremost, you're supposed to think that what I'm doing, is it in the interest of public? Is it in public good? But that again, that's a utopia. We are well past those times. So therefore, these are commercial organizations. I think one of the greatest education that needs to happen among public is that journalism is a business. Yeah, it's not a service, and therefore you have to have a healthy level of distrust in media. I think that's good for public health to not rely on journalists. Now, if you look at the reporting globally on this, I think the greatest disservice to public, in this pandemic, apart from crazy measures by government, has come from journalists,
Mm-hmm.
and they've been very poor at communicating this risk. And on top of that, they've been going hammer and tong against governments that did not take their orders, right? So I, as a journalist, said something. How dare you not,
Mm-hmm.
implement measures? Like I said. So you remember the days they went hammer and tong about um, Kawasaki-like syndrome among kids, and kids are at a great risk, and so on and so forth, right? So and then that led to a huge amount of panic because when it comes to children, like Dr. Osterholm, a very good epidemiologist, says that you can't think of denominators and percentages, right? So, the moment kids come into the picture, you only have to think of numerators, right? So, you can't say, and therefore, what tends to happen is that one is this thing of control, right? As a journalist, right? So, I can write something and then I have this power, right? So, and therefore, I want to use that power. Uh, Two is ignorance. So when in often we talk about how it's not the brightest of people who get into journalism, but I think more importantly, if you go back in time, it's not like a journalist is an expert, right? And journalists were very aware of their own shortcomings. So they would go talk to a doctor, talk to a scientist, verify this. How do I frame this story, right? So talk to four or five people and then push through a
Mm-hmm.
story, right? I mean, that's what
Absolutely.
that's the least you expect from a journalist. You don't expect them to be experts in everything. That's not possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what they do, right? So they just hear this news. And I've been on the other end where some journalists wanted a story, and I would tell them, hold off, talk to this gentleman, get more context. And they would say, no, no, I've already pushed the story. I just need a quote from, right? So just say something, and then I'm writing good things about you. Just say you agree, and then and then after a point, I felt kind of disgusted to talk about them because there's a lot of misrepresentation happening, anyway. So, and of course, I mean, most of the listeners would understand that sensationalizing bit of it. So when they hear this, it just seems like, oh wow, so many doctors got it. This is going to be a great story. So let me not wait before others because the first one kind of gets all the benefit. And then it's kind of a continuing spiral paranoia, right? So the next guy will say, oh, they found in this hospital. Let me go find in another hospital. Let me go find in the entire state, right? So you have this, spiral paranoia that happens where you'll have a glut of stories about how doctors across the country are, catching the virus, and therefore, uh, uh, you create this public fear, right? Uh, and that often happens not just in this story, but in a range of other stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we kind of hold them accountable, right? So you're not paying them for their service.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you are not. You don't have a formal kind of a mechanism or redressal to write about them, and then get someone fired or demand kind of better standards. But unfortunately, measured purely by, like you said, eyeballs or the number of shares or engagement, and the perverse incentives make it seem like that's the only way to go. Now, what is the way out of it? I mean, thankfully, we have uh, social media. That's a positive and a negative. On WhatsApp, all kinds of messages kind of fly through. But the very basic thing, I mean, I think it's expecting too much, but the very basic thing we can demand is that news organizations put journalists through simple training on, numbers and data, right? Uh, uh, it's not that difficult, right? It's like a 1 day, 2 day course saying, hey, when you're reporting numbers and percentages, these are some rules that you need to kind of follow. And therefore, that would be in public good. But then again, that's expecting too much because the incentives are not aligned. So, I mean, that's the world that we are in, that you can't even take like few hours off and understand, risk and data communication better. Now, uh, if I were in a journalist organization, I mean, one of the things that we see happening, right, across board, and my colleague Pratyasha was mentioning this in another context, is that people conflate preventive and protective,
Uh-huh.
right? So, what is preventive, right? Something that you will never get. Protective is that you might get it, but it won't affect you, right? So, in the context of, say, COVID, if I take a vaccine, right? Preventive is that I'll never catch this virus. Protective is that I might catch this virus, but nothing will happen to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the way people are reading the data is that they're thinking, 100% preventive, right? So if I take a vaccine, I should never get it, right?
Yeah.
That's not going to be the case. And when you're vaccinating millions of people, right? So 100 million people, and if the vaccine efficacy is 80%, right? As far as its ability to prevent is concerned,
Mm-hmm.
20% of the people are at risk. When you think about the whole country, that's a huge number. That's like 200 million people, right? Or if you take the eligible population, at least more than 100 million people who are going to catch this virus, right? And if you're going to have journalists who kind of keep reporting that this person, got COVID in spite of getting vaccines, of course, they're going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Again, this is something that I was tweeting about long back, is that one of the first thing any health ministry should have done is called all the editors before vaccine rollout
Yes.
and explained this, saying, hey, this is going to happen. People who got vaccinated are going to get COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
What else is going to happen? There are going to be a lot of correlated deaths. There are people who get vaccine and would die. Some would die within the hour, some would die the next day, some would die within a week. Because unfortunately, people die all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other thing to communicate, saying that, hey, there are going to be a lot of correlated deaths. Doesn't mean that we are going to ignore them. We are going to, investigate every death. But bear in mind that as long as the overall death rate doesn't go up, which means it's just a correlation and not a causation. But
Mm-hmm.
it's natural for humans to kind of see causation where one doesn't exist, right? So uh, it's a classic thing that happens with with vaccines. But it's only now that we are vaccinating so many people in such a short span of time. Earlier, vaccinations happened, at birth and at a slow frequency. Even if there are correlated deaths, they don't go reported, right? So, but now this vaccine has been developed in, full public attention, with people
Mm-hmm.
paying attention to every little detail, seeing all these numbers, and therefore you're going to have a lot of correlated deaths. You have a lot of reporters on the ground who need stories, right? And they are on the WhatsApp of many ordinary people. So all you need to do is just say, hey, this man got a vaccine yesterday and he died today. And therefore, that's going to become a story. So priming all these, journalists upfront, right? Saying that these are going to happen and this is how to report it. We are not asking not to report, but, you have to provide context and that we are going to investigate. Now, the problem with this is that you can't do it now. You're you either tell public in advance. Now, if you say it, it looks like you're justifying, right? So now you are playing defense.
Yeah, the cat's
Uh,
out of the bag.
exactly. So it's gone, right? So now, whatever you do, you're always going to be late, and people are going to say, "Ah, this is what they'll say," right? So this is a classic case where and these strategies kind of existed. It's pretty much the norm. You should have kind of issued guidelines saying that this is going to happen. This is where I think we have this, while public can be, including myself, we can be poor at reading numbers. But people are not idiots, right? And I think often governments make this assumption that if we don't square up with people, right? If we tell people that there are going to be some people who are dying, there's going to be the case that some people are going to catch the virus, that people will somehow not take the vaccine, right? So that they're so dumb that they won't. So therefore, we should not say these things. I think to the contrary, we should be transparent to the extent possible and tell people that this is going to happen, and then explain to people the difference between preventive and protective, right? Otherwise, it's just a number race, right? I'll take this vaccine because it's 95%, effective. I won't take the J&J vaccine because it's only 60% effective. These are all crazy numbers, right? So, I mean, there are better trade-offs with, say, a J&J vaccine because it's one shot and you get the protection in 2 weeks. And that's a danger of producing all these numbers that people, again, the other thing that we are not good at is making decisions based on a range of factors, right? So take buying a car, for example, right? So if I have a choice between three, four cars, there's so much data, right? So what is the mileage? What is the price? The safety features in this car, the design features. I mean, the list is long. So what do car companies do, right? So they want you to go for a test drive, right? So then you sit in the car and say, I like this car, right? It's no longer about the numbers. So I think beyond 4 or 5 variables, I think it's very difficult for us to make a rational decision. And the risk
Absolutely.
of and the risk of pushing through some of these numbers is that people start taking decisions based on those numbers, and then we start misinterpreting those numbers. And therefore you have this scenario like the one that you put up, saying so many doctors got it. Of course, I mean, as they would, right? It's not 100% preventive. And if there are significant comorbidities, there would be, unfortunately, some deaths. But again, they don't provide the context. So if you reduce everything to like 140 or 280 characters, I mean, then the worst headline becomes the best headline as far as, getting clicks is concerned. Again, like I said, it's not a very difficult skill. It's not, it's something that news organizations can do quite easily, but they won't because their incentives are aligned to communicating this in a sensational manner, in a manner to kind of scare people. And they're not mindful of the consequences, right? So, and therefore, you have this crazy situation where before we started hitting these crazy numbers in India, like in my hometown, my mom was telling me people like volunteers were like going door to door asking people to take vaccines. But because of all this reporting, and we were discussing earlier, the other disservice that happens is telling people that nothing changes with the vaccine. Right? I mean, so now look at how we have loaded the trade-offs, right? If you get the vaccine, you still might get COVID. Even if you get vaccine, you can't, you still have to wear masks, you have to distance, and you have to stay at home. So what is the real incentive for taking a vaccine? So unless there is some reward in taking a vaccine, why would people take it? Right? And whatever that we are doing, we are undermining confidence in vaccines by a combination of fear that it may not work, and the crazy, regulations that even after you get it, you should not go out because you could spread. Uh, uh,
By the way,
uh,
that transmission evidence is literally zero.
yeah, exactly. So this is this. I mean, public health officials never get blamed for overestimating the risk, right? So they're
Mhm.
always worried about underestimating the risk. If I say 1,000 people die and 10,000 die, it's a huge problem. And if I say
Mm,
10,000 die and only 1,000 die, it's not as much as a problem, right?
mm.
But now that we have vaccines, that strategy won't work. So you have to have a lot of confidence in the vaccines based on data, right? So you don't want to lie to people. but but you have to tell people what like it is and communicate some of the rewards of taking vaccines. Now, of course, we have high numbers, and therefore most people want vaccines. I mean, imagine this, right? So you're eligible for a vaccine, and the vaccine is either around the corner or available, and you catch the disease and die, right? I mean, it's the worst case scenario, and therefore vaccine hesitancy can harm people, and it is real. And all of these stories that we are seeing kind of add to that, right? So today we might be in a situation where all these states are saying, "Oh, we don't have enough supply," which, by the way, is such a common story everywhere. Even in the US, all states start blaming the central government, saying, "Oh, we don't have vaccines." I mean, the center does not keep it locked up somewhere, right? In the sense that whatever they have, they distribute. Uh, it's not like this utopian entity which is ruling 10 other countries. But uh, once you have them, you don't do a good job of giving it. Now there is high demand, but this yo-yo is going to continue. Soon you're going to have so many vaccines, and people don't want to then take it, either because a lot of others have taken it, or because of all these framing problems that we talked about, and all these fears that people have of side effects or correlated deaths, or like the tweet that you mentioned saying doctors got it, so what's the point of taking it? uh,
Yeah,
I,
I just wanted to add a few things over here. So I did
yep.
a simple trick. So I'm sure you must be facing these kind of people on a daily basis too, but I've faced just far too many people. So I was talking to a few friends of mine. They're like, "यार कुशल, मगर वैक्सीन लेने के बाद भी कोविड का इन्फेक्शन होता है, you get infected again." I was like, okay, so like you said, it is preventive and the other option, right? So I told them, I played a very simple trick with them, and this is how I convinced them. So I told them, okay, what do you remember last year that is not happening this year? They're like, no, no, you tell me. I was like, okay, do you remember from March, April, May onwards, every day we were inundated with those sad headlines of frontline workers dying, doctors dying, because of COVID, because they were basically, doctors and healthcare workers are basically exposed to the highest viral load of COVID, period, because they
Yep.
are inside those environments where they are surrounded by COVID patients. I was like, are you getting that news right now? They're like, huh, we're not getting that news right now. I said,
Yep.
did you ever ask yourself why you're not getting that news right now? He's like, no, we did not. I was like, what is the one difference between last year and this year? He's like, oh yeah, vaccine ho gaya. So I was like, chalta hai ki nahi chalta hai vaccine? Is it effective or not effective? So you see, the classic case over here is the entire framing of the vaccine should not have been based on infection. It should have been based on morbidity and mortality, right?
Yep.
So do you get some other morbidities? Let's say, there are, every time I'll talk to a person, they'll be like, okay, you may not die because of COVID, but you might get some morbidity. So I was like, okay, so what do the vaccines prevent the most? All vaccines, we have enough data, have as good as 100% protection from mortality. All vaccines, it doesn't matter, right?
Yep.
And vaccines also have a significant increase as far as protection from future morbidities caused due to COVID. Now, when you're framing and you're trying to sell a vaccine to people so that they go out there and they get vaccinated, how should this have been done? I mean, at least when I use this trick with people, it seems to work. They're like, no, you have a point. That actually they're not dying. The doctors are not dying because all of them are vaccinated. So that means we should get vaccinated. Now, if a person, a layman like me, who has literally no say in this process, why the hell can't people inside the government of India, why the hell can't editors get something as basic as this? So, in that case, this is a clear, I mean, Ram, this has been the story in India, right? When there were vaccines that were being developed so that they can be launched, everything was, I hate Modi so much, so I will doubt everything about the vaccine itself. Now the vaccine has come out, it seems to be working. Now I hate Modi so much that why aren't you vaccinating everyone? Now, मतलब तमाशा बना दिया है. We have made a joke of this entire process, And in this entire process, like another data point, right? We have 12 crore senior citizens in India, 60 and above. We should be really worried that even now, not even 4 crore people have come forward and taken a vaccine, even after the portal being open for more than a month and a half. I mean, we have had the portal open for senior citizens, which shows what? There are three kinds of scenarios here. One, people are getting turned off because of these rumors. uh, Two, people are not getting an access to the vaccine. Maybe they're in remote areas because of infrastructural issues. And three, there is a huge chunk in India that is just not scared of COVID. Has anybody factored in that? They don't have any fear of COVID. They're like,
Yep.
huh. So in such a scenario, I actually wanted to share some more data, and I wanted you to explain this. So
Mhm.
the source is National Crime Records Bureau, Ministry of Road and Transport and Highway, Law Commission of India, and Global Status Report on Road Safety 2013. So I'm just going to read the data out of this. This is basically top 10 cities of India with the highest number of road crash deaths rank wise. Number one is Delhi, then Chennai, Jaipur, Bengaluru, Mumbai, Kanpur, Lucknow, Agra, Hyderabad, Pune. And this is the data. One serious road accident in the country occurs every minute and 16 die on the Indian roads every hour. 1,214 road crashes occur every day in India. Two wheelers account for 25% of total road crash deaths. 20 children under the age of 14 die every day due to road crashes in the country. 377 people die every day, equivalent to a jumbo jet crashing every day. Two people die every hour in Uttar Pradesh, the state with the maximum number of road crash deaths. Tamil Nadu is the state with the maximum number of road crash injuries. Now, why don't people stop buying two wheelers? Why don't people start driving on the roads? What is so unique about COVID?
Road safety is a favorite topic of mine, something that I've done a lot of work.
Yeah, that's why I
Uh,
got this statistic out, because I know you've done so much work on it.
by the way, by 2030, I think road accidents will overtake HIV as a leading cause of death. They're already a leading cause of death among 15 to 24-year-olds, I think,
Mhm.
among the youngest of our population. Unfortunately, it does not get the attention or the funding. In fact, for every dollar spent on road safety, you can save much more lives than, say, in some of the health conditions. There are a combination of factors, right? So one is that this risk is seen as something that in your hands, right? So if you did a simple survey and asked a room full of people if they're average, above average, or excellent drivers, something like 90% of the people would say they are above average or excellent, right? Uh, so there is this classic overconfidence when it comes to driving, and there are a, a lot of other factors. I mean, one of the greatest being that driving involves something like 1,500 subskills. It's one of the most complex things that we do as humans, right? You
Mhm.
have all your senses, eyes, ears, touch. So all your senses are working. And it's actually a difficult task, but something that the greatness of our brain is that even as complex as driving, we master it within days, and then it starts seeming kind of easy. Uh, and why do people still kind of drive crazy and get into all of this? And like I said, a combination of factors like I said, overconfidence, or in some cases risk compensation. There are all these crazy numbers that new cars have a higher rate of accidents than old cars. Right? So you have a new car, you think you can drive faster. There's this really interesting experiment on in Germany, I think, among cab drivers. So they did split between car taxis with ABS and taxis without ABS, right? So you would think anti-lock braking system would lead to less accidents. There was no statistical difference because your brain starts discounting for better safety features, and therefore you start taking more risks. And like again in India, I think the roads are can take more speed than the vehicles. What do I mean by that? So you can say this road is 100 kilometers per hour road. That's for a good car, but if you have a bike or if you are a pedestrian, it's like too much of risk. You can go into a combination of things, but overall, I think it's there is a little bit of numbing that happens because it's happening all the while. Two, it's not contagious like COVID, right? So there is no the level of progression is very different, right? In COVID today, yep.
Just wanted to share one more data point with you, Ram, and then you can go ahead. But road accidents are 10 times more likely to take our lives than COVID.
Yeah, but it's not contagious, right? And I think I have control over it, right? Uh, so if you ask someone who's driving, what are your chances of dying in an accident? You'd say nothing because I've been doing this all my life. Uh, and by the way, many of these road accidents are not even reported, right? So you think that you're not at risk or you have high control, right? So that's the thing. And the numbers are crazy, by the way. Something like 150,000, 200,000 people in India die because of road accidents. It's not something that gets the same kind of attention, and it's also not a spectacular risk, right? So COVID is a spectacular risk. It's a global risk. A nuclear thing is a spectacular risk. Therefore, we are very scared of nuclear power, whereas all the numbers suggest otherwise, right? So the number of people who die because of pollution because of, say, a coal power plant versus the number of people who died in, say, a nuclear power plant, right? So how many people died in, Fukushima, right? But that's a spectacular risk. So therefore, we are more scared of those things. I mean, again, all risks are not same. Some risks are more salient, more spectacular, and therefore we tend to overweight those as opposed to some of the others.
So,
I
so
see that you're
imagine this scenario, Ram. So I'm just,
yeah.
highlighting this to give people a context. During 2019, the fatality rate per 100 crashes was around 30. Based on the media tracking and deduplication done by our organization, 145 out of 381 road deaths occur between March 24th and May 16th were migrants, said Piyush Tiwari of Save Life Foundation. Now
Hmm.
look at the data here. A road
Hmm.
crash is 10 times more likely to kill someone than getting infected with COVID-19. I
Yeah.
mean, this is shocking that how the human mind plays games, don't you think? I mean, but then my follow-up question to you would be is that how do we convince people, not that I'm saying you should not take COVID seriously. I want you to take COVID seriously, but you have to take it seriously in the right way, right? You
Yep.
have to take it seriously in the right way, like wear a mask and try to maintain personal hygiene as much as you can and get vaccinated whenever you get a chance. But my point is that how can we be so callous in one department? It's like diarrhea deaths in India. Something, who would have thought something as innocuous as diarrhea kills 1,400 people daily in India?
TB.
TB. And again, look at the irony of this. You get a tuberculosis vaccine when you're born, but you still have TB in India. But that vaccine everybody is fine with. But COVID ka vaccine is dangerous. I don't get all of this. So how do we, how do we unpack this weird human behavior? I can't make sense of it.
I think some of them have like a very evolutionary basis to it, and therefore we have to kind of live with it. So there's a very interesting statistic. So what is, I think Gerd frames it well, says how many kilometers do you have to drive uh, for the same amount of risk of, say, dying in an air crash on a flight, say, between Bombay and Delhi, right? Uh, and if I'm not mistaken, it's like 5 or 7 miles, right? So
Yeah.
that's the huge amount of risk. But again, plane crashes are spectacular, and therefore they're reported heavily, and therefore we tend to kind of overweight those risks. And like I said, I think we are more tuned to paying more attention towards spectacular risks, and therefore uh, uh, we are more fearful of certain things which we should not be. But I think coming to this, point on how do we kind of address some of these responses to COVID? How can we be more pragmatic?
So
If you,
you had talked about when you had sent some points to me, you had mentioned about balancing risk and rewards.
yep,
That's the part, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
so
that's a,
Cal,
yeah, I'll talk about that. I mean, again, before going, I mean, the thing again in driving is that we are very good at calculating risks. We are very poor at calculating rewards. Nobody calculates the rewards one gets by driving like really fast, right? I mean, there is a certain thrill in that. Uh, Coming to COVID, right? So, I mean, if you go back to March, when you ask people to take a spectacular measure like a lockdown, right, which is a blunt instrument, right? So you shut
Mhm.
everything down. And therefore, people start thinking that, this is, apocalypse, and therefore we can't get outside. I mean, I see people out in the open. They're the only people in the road for, hundreds of meters together, and they still wear a mask because we have this perception that this virus is like on the trees and on top of the buildings, like waiting to kind of pounce upon you. Uh, Double masking and triple masking and so on and so forth. But what we have told public is like this is spectacular risk, and therefore we have this like really blunt instrument, no compromise, right? And therefore you have kind of primed people to either take too much precaution or no precaution at all, right? So there are always going to be contrarians who will say, I don't feel scared or I don't want to feel scared, so therefore I won't do anything, right? And then you have people saying, this is the worst thing on the planet in my lifetime, and therefore I'm going to do everything, even if it's kind of overdone. Instead of that, if we are a little bit more measured, saying, wear a mask, but not outdoors when you're not around people, right? So
Mhm.
if you are a little bit more pragmatic in asking people to take certain measures, you're better off. So you consumed so much attention and load in getting people to wash their hands and wipe things, then communicating multiple, behaviors is difficult. I mean, I'll give you another classic example. Say diabetes, right? When somebody is diagnosed with diabetes, the doctor looks at it, this is a very easy condition to treat. He'll tell you, hey, all you have to do is to stop eating carbs and sugar, start taking these pills, right? And going on a walk every day for 30 minutes, and then check your glucose regularly, right? It's simple, right? I mean, like very doable, just for behaviors.
Mhm.
But multiple behaviors are very difficult to push through, right? So it takes a lot for us to kind of add new behaviors, and that's one of the points I was making is that habit change is much slower than science. You can't suddenly pull
Mhm.
the plug and say, hey, now you don't have to wash your hands that much, focus that attention on masks, right? So we kind of overused our energy, so to speak, on one set of activity. So one, I think we need to get a little bit more pragmatic and allow for certain rewards, saying don't do this indoors, don't do these indoors. If you're vaccinated, these are the things that you can do freely, and these are the things that you know. I can't think of anything that you cannot do once you're fully vaccinated. But then, uh, so if you communicate those things, it's better. And two, I want to come back to the point that you made about uh, you know a sudden drop in death among healthcare workers.
Mhm.
That's a great way of communicating risk, right? Because it's a nice heuristic. I don't have to make sense of a lot of numbers. You can say, hey, we vaccinated all the doctors and healthcare workers. This is
Mhm.
how many died last year, right? In say April of 2020. And so this is the number in April of 2020. So it's a classic split window, right? And people can look at it and say, huh. So the only variable is vaccine, a negative and a positive. From a communication point of view, that's a good thing, saying that, again, look at all this data, deaths are going to drop dramatically. So if you kind of vaccinate 30-40% of the people and therefore vaccines work, the risk there is that once the deaths start dropping precipitously, you are again faced with the scenario where a number of people don't want to get vaccines, and therefore you're still going to have these, flash fires here and there,
Mm.
where people might still kind of get COVID. But overall, I think like communicating some of the rewards on vaccines, focusing on protection and not prevention, saying you won't end up in the hospital and you won't die. right, is a much better framing than saying you won't get it, right? Uh, and then, since, like I said, we have a negativity bias, five people around me get it. I think everybody around me is getting it, whereas like 100 people did not get it, right? So we don't focus on the people who don't get it. We only focus on the people who get it. And again, I mean, these are all like very obvious things for governments before, right? And I think most governments have dropped the ball on like estimating hesitancy, right? And if you have to talk about hesitancy again, like, they've focused too much on these anti-vaxxers, right? That's a very, very small group, and it's a hopeless group. There's nothing you can do to that
Yeah.
group, right? That's very, very hardcore. But when you think of hesitancy, right, one, it is real and it's different, right? So some people are indifferent, some people are wait and watch, some people are worried about side effects, right? Instead, what do we do globally? Like Fauci is everywhere, right? Saying, talking about vaccine hesitancy. I mean, people who believe in him, people who respect him, are not the people who will hesitate to take a vaccine. Right? So they'll go ahead and take it. So overall, politicians have a limited appeal unless they have very high approval ratings. So I would say, like if a Biden saying please take the vaccine has very little impact, right? Because I mean he's the president. People, a simple photograph of him taking the vaccine would do the job. That's the other thing. We have underestimated hesitancy. We have overestimated the value of politicians and celebrities in minimizing hesitancy. Instead of focusing on the factors that drive hesitancy, right? Is it like fear of side effects? Is it, wait and watch? Is it indifference? Or like you said, people are don't perceive, very low risk perception. Uh, and then, have much more targeted kind of messaging. The number you said of, like less than 4 crore people in India in that age group getting is a very crazy number because I mean you could still have high cases and significantly lower fatalities if you have vaccinated high risk population, right? And that's what states like Florida did here, like really well. You could still have like 8,000, 9,000 cases and have very few fatalities if you vaccinated high risk people. And 4 out of 12 crores is a dangerously low number, right? Which means there's going to be a lot of pain in terms of fatalities. So I think to sum it up, instead of all these numbers and percentages, we have to find heuristic way of communicating the benefits. Focus on protection and providing as much context as possible when talking about vaccinated people, still getting the disease.
So before I start taking the questions of the live viewers, I just have one last question because this is something you had tweeted about, and this is something even I am very torn about. So, while we are talking about incentivizing people to get a vaccine, so Ram, let us talk a little bit about. And also, I want to. Why did Ram and I make this entire discussion about vaccination? Is because we want to nudge people towards getting a vaccine. So I want you guys to understand why we are so obsessed with the vaccine. We can easily look at the data and talk about COVID too, but we not talk about the vaccine is because somewhere down the line, even Ram and I want to nudge you and make sure that everybody in your house who is 45 and above and watching this in India goes and gets a vaccine. But here's the point. So to incentivize vaccinations, and here's the thing, Ram, this pandemic has been the biggest encroachment on our rights as individuals, on our rights as citizens of democratic nations across the world, whether it's the United States of America, whether it's Canada, whether it's England, whether it's India. Public health officials under the garb of a pandemic have literally robbed us of our basic rights. It's a constant tussle between public health and our rights. In the case of a vaccine, we've started listening to whispers of something like a vaccine passport. So let's say I want to travel to the United States of America. Let's say I want to use public health of public transport. So what if somebody from BEST in Mumbai or Mumbai Railways says that, what, if you're not vaccinated and you do not have a valid reason that if you take a vaccine you might have some medical conditions, but everybody else, 18 and above, say 1 year down the line, if they are not vaccinated, they will not be given access to public transport. How do we work around that? That might encourage people to go and get a vaccine in the short term. But Ram, how do we balance that scenario where, on one hand, we have a complete assault on our right to choose vis a vis our safety from COVID?
No. So I completely agree with you. It's not just a wealth transfer; it's like a power transfer from citizens to governments, mostly unelected officials, and it's a very dangerous thing. Nobody lets go of power ever. Uh, and you have a situation where most of the people who have this power have not personally been affected, uh, either in terms of their wages or their status, right? So you have this scenario where a small number of people have too much power, and you also have people who don't get trade-offs, right? So you're always thinking, I want to save every single person from COVID. Now, it's a very, very noble kind of thought, but there is nothing called zero risk. Every time you step out, you take a risk. Every business you start, you take a risk, right? So, therefore, this entire zero risk, zero death is a silly proposition. So, therefore, I wrote a piece early on saying it's always the politician who has to take these decisions because he gets trade-offs, right? And he's accountable. So you can't
Mhm,
fire the head of ICMR, right? But you can fire the prime minister or a president of
mhm,
a nation in an election, and they are the ones who have to make trade-offs between economy and public health. And as I keep saying, it's not good for public health officials to be on TV all the time, right? That's not the sign of a healthy nation, right? So they need to go back into the background. And the more that they talk about some of these draconian measures, the more you kind of undermine, public trust and confidence. Now, coming to the specific point on vaccine passports, luckily that ship is sailed in the US, it looks like. I'm totally against it. uh, I'm totally against any paternalistic thing, right? So not just, I would say, it's not just about. Uh, I would say it's not being paternalistic, right? Moment you use laws and rules, then it's not nudge anymore. Nudge works when people have a natural intent to do something, and if you communicate with them in a transparent manner and provide some kind of an incentive to do it. I'll give you a simple example. So air travel, right? So if I say that if for you to travel by air today, you have to produce an RT-PCR test, right? If I say that if you are vaccinated, you don't need to produce an RT-PCR test, right? So that's an incentive, right? But what are we doing?
mhm.
We say it doesn't matter whether you're vaccinated or not, you still need an RT-PCR test, right? So I think those are some of the things that you can do. Making it easier, reducing friction in the system. Unfortunately, most of the people who are at the highest risk are also least digitally savvy, right? I keep talking to a lot of 70, 75-year-olds. They struggle to go online and find an appointment. Luckily in India, because we don't have this like concept of old age homes, you have multi-generation households, and therefore
Mhm.
youngsters have probably helped them. But I think I would rely on smaller incentives like those rather than hard measures saying, unless you're vaccinated, you can or cannot do these things. It's not enforceable. It's a perfect recipe for a lot of corruption. And I think it's about giving away more powers. And the most dangerous thing with all of this is
Mhm.
precedence. It's not just that we have given these powers and created a precedent for COVID. You have created this precedent so that in future people are going to invoke this and create passports for all kinds of things, right? And you don't want that kind of a precedence, going forward. So in light of immediate fear, right? So we cannot create structures and systems that will harm us in future, and that's something that we need to be very vigilant about.
Hmm. All right, so now let's start taking questions. So So I guess Brijesh had asked a question when we were talking about media. There are a lot of questions about the media. So I'm just going to read them out. So, how is this responsible for public health communication? What the hell is the media doing? And then somebody had actually followed it up and said, um, why should incorrect and misleading media reports be let off scot free? Shouldn't Indian law have such reporters arrested and tried under sedition? Now, I think that's a little bit. See, this is the problem with India. We either have one side where we have a type of intention, and the other side we are like, "Inko sabko jail mein dal do." So, how do we balance it out, Ram?
Yeah, I think, like I said, it's a very simple task to accomplish, but the incentives are not aligned, right? So, in the immediate future, I think it would be great for public to know that journalists are not working in their interest, that these are commercial organizations working with a
Mm-hmm.
profit motive. And that's not going to change, right? So, you're not going to have like Doordarshan or whatever. So, one way of changing is that if there is a kind of a regular briefing that happens on a day-to-day basis, where a respectable figure who knows how to communicate. I think that's very, very critical. You have a lot of ministers and public health people who don't know how to communicate, who can communicate in an empathetic manner with public, start dispelling some of these things, and that if that happens as a routine feature at the same time in in languages people kind of understand, that would be a good thing. So you need to have a counter kind of an effort on a day-to-day basis, uh, which has to have certain preemptive quality to it, because we know what the next story is going to be. Like this vaccine story, the tweet that you mentioned. I mean, anybody would have predicted this.
Yeah.
I've been tweeting about this all the while. I mean, these are very predictable things. It's not like these are like evil geniuses, right? So you know where their head is, and you know where these stories are going to come from.
Oh, yeah.
So, so I think some level of preemptive communication needs to happen, and uh, and therefore, as trust starts eroding from many of these journalists, then you might have a new incentive, which is the old incentive of I want to be a trustworthy journalist, as opposed to be a journalist who gets the most amount of clicks. I mean, like prosecution, and then that turns villains into heroes. They're suddenly this guy gets to play the martyr, and then as a nation, we don't have that capacity to prosecute all these people. It's like needless distraction. Uh, you're much better off preempting some of these things and communicating with transparency and trust and empathy, and calling out some of these things.
So this
Specifically.
this
Yeah.
follow up question is even better. Then
Mm.
Tanmay says, when the public relations of the government does such a pathetic job of information dissipation, especially with regards to such efficacy data, what can you expect from an extremely biased, non-credible Indian media? I mean, I'm telling you, Tanmay has hit the nail on the head here. That is
Yeah.
spot on. When you have such a nick in the government, why do you expect anything else from your media that already hates the government?
Yeah, I mean, it's like devil in the deep sea. But yeah, look at the same politicians, right? So they're so great at election campaigning, right? I mean, their most of their speeches are well researched, right? So between a 1 hour helicopter ride between town A and town B,
Mhm.
right? A politician gets a talking points. He comes to your town and talk about the issues in that town, and they can talk for an hour, and they can connect greatly, right? So there's a great amount of resonance. But when it comes to public health, they're like fish out of water, right? So again, like I said, these are things any government needs to prepare. They don't take a lot of time. They don't take a lot of effort. You can test a lot of these things in real time with, given our internet penetration and social media. I could put out a message and test how, are people comprehending it? Do they find it effective? Like at 8 in the morning, and have something out, later in the day. I mean, you should have the equivalent of the IT cells for public health, right? I mean, they can churn out content very quickly. If a politician says something stupid, within an hour you have a video, right? So why can't you have the same thing for public health? It's to my mind, it's not a thing of skill or resources as much as attention, uh, and it's something that we should demand from the government. If not, then some vested interest will fill that vacuum, right?
Mhm.
And it'll be like another YouTuber crackpot who would make things worse, right? I mean,
Yeah, I know one crackpot in India who sits outside India. So, do you think absolute numbers in case of countries like India and China is a nonsense metric? The correct metric should be per 100 or per 1,000 inhabitants. What's your thought?
yeah, it's. I think there are two dimensions to it, right? So one, when you're communicating, right? So you can't look at human life just as numbers, right? So every death is a tragedy, and I, I think you come across as really cold and unempathetic when you say our numbers are not that high. I think one, we have to recognize that every life is important, but base rate fallacy, right? The point that you're making is again one of those classic things where, like we said, percentage of what, thousand of what, it's not something that we ask, right? So when you look at, say, data on, say, John Hopkins or Boulder meters, right, you only see the absolute numbers and you don't see the base rate. So if you go and see the base rate, so the fatalities of US, say, per million in states like New York would be, I don't know, something like 1700. For India, it would be 150. It's a significantly low number. So I think when communicating, therefore, using the base always helps from a policy making, from taking steps, right? So you could say that, oh my God, there are 1,000 deaths here. Of course, in a country of a billion people, is it too many? Uh, but there are other metrics too that we track in terms of hospitalization. The other thing to see is that where is it happening, right? I mean, if it's happening in a highly concentrated manner, right? So there's no point saying there are 1,000 people dying across India. If 500 of those are happening, say, in Pune, right? So your base rate has to be relevant, and you have to track some of the other, leading indicators like hospitalization from a policy point of view. But again, these absolute numbers, that's a classic mistake journalists keep making all the time, saying India has the highest number of cases in the world today. True, but what's our population, right? Uh, Again, uh, there are a lot of good journalists who torture data and take data points that are most convenient to their story, right? So that's another thing to kind of bear in mind.
So this one even I'm not really aware of. So why aren't scientists not discussing most important risk factor, that is metabolic syndrome, in relation to COVID? One third of the population is metabolically unhealthy, and still guidelines don't have any restriction on carbohydrates. I don't know about that. I
Yep,
know the Indian
it's
diet in general is slightly carb heavy, but as far as I'm concerned, the only single correlation causation that I have been able to find when it comes to deaths and COVID has been, obviously you need 2.2 on an average comorbidity. Those people are much more probable to die, and vitamin D deficiency. I have not heard of anything else, at least in my
yeah. That's a great question, actually. uh, Metabolic syndrome, in the sense that, think of, like, say, insulin resistance and diabetes, right? So early on, I think in May or some of 2020, there was a very interesting study done on mortality among diabetics, whose sugar levels or A1C is well controlled or poorly controlled, right? So this is a great study. So the risk of dying from COVID, if you have controlled diabetes, is, say, 1 in 100, and the risk of dying with diabetes, and if you have uncontrolled, diabetes, is 10 in 100. The risk is tenfold. So both are diabetics. One has his sugar levels controlled. One does not. And I was tweeting then saying we should be communicating this to all the diabetes patients in the world, saying, hey, here is a real incentive for you to bring your sugar levels down, right? You may be at high risk, but if you control this, right, so you have a real opportunity to kind of escape death. And I think there is ample data in the US that talks about, I think, whether it's two-thirds, I think, of all the people who died, an underlying condition is obesity. But again, thanks to our PC culture, nobody wants to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so instead of like asking people to go out, get a walk, eat better, like lower stress and manage your diabetes, we have not focused on the things. Like someone said, there is a fast pandemic and there's a slow pandemic. The fast pandemic is COVID, and the slow pandemic is all these metabolic kind of issues. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it is a real opportunity to drive home some of those messages. But again, we're so focused on certain aspects of it and ignored many of these underlying factors where some real gains and long-term gains could have been made.
Hmm. So, good follow up point. So, mortality rate of Vietnam is probably the least because it is the most least obese country in the world. On the other hand, US is the most obese. You know the data. But
Yeah.
see, Bugsy, you have to understand. Now, I'm going to get into my social justice activist mode. You have to support the body positivity mode
Yeah.
movement, right? How
Yeah.
dare you fat shame people? And let me tell you, now on a serious note, yes, obesity is a huge problem. As someone who was obese till 2016, I don't know how many times I've said this, please lose weight. It fundamentally changed my life at an individual level. So I'm begging all of you, believe me, I lost more than, when I had lost my peak weight from 96 kilos, I went down to 67 kilos. I cannot explain how good it feels. Please take it seriously. But another person has asked this question: is it true that companies like Serum Institute are facing production shortages? Now, Tanmay, before I pass it on to Ram, I just want to put this on record. You have to understand what do you mean by production shortages. There is always going to be a manufacturing constraint, right? Again, you have to take this in perspective. Look, India anyways manufactures 70% of the entire world's vaccines of all types. So I mean, we can't expect 1.4 billion people or 1 billion people to get a shot in their ass the first day itself. Come on, let's get real. And on top of that, we have such humongous vaccine hesitancy. So now that I've said that, Ram, do you have any points to add on both these questions?
Yeah, I mean, on obesity, I think we both have rights. I'm still fat, but I lost the obesity tag during the pandemic. I lost something like 70 pounds. I need to lose 30 more. Uh, but I think there's no shame in, I think, telling people that they need to lose weight. I think all this body positivity, putting obese people on, covers of magazines, at the very least, you can't celebrate it. I understand that it's very hard to lose weight. It's not easy, but I mean, most things in life are hard. Right? I mean, nothing comes easy. If that is your excuse, then I mean, you don't even want to get out of the bed, right? It's so easy to kind of sleep through. But I think this is something that people are needlessly worried about, something that we should level with public and tell them that not just in the short term, but in the long term, this has I mean, a lot of good benefits, right? So you reduce the burden on the healthcare system. One of the reasons insurance is so expensive in this country is that we are so obese in the US, and therefore it's a huge burden on the healthcare system. Even in India, I mean, the number of people who have diabetes is huge, and that's a crisis kind of that's staring at us. This was a great opportunity to kind of drive home the point on reducing, both near-term and long-term risks. Uh, we can't let all this PC nonsense harm public health. That's what we have done, right? So we have traded off political correctness for public health, and it's inexcusable. On production shortages, like I said, there is no real incentive for any government or any business to produce less than what they can, right? I mean, there is no for them. It's incentive to kind of their incentives are aligned with producing more vaccines and distributing more vaccines. India, as the leading producer of vaccines, in fact, there's a lot of BS reporting saying India doesn't invest in vaccine research. People should go and read up on CEPI. It's a Center for Epidemic Preparedness. I think in 2017, India is one of the few countries, along with Norway, who joined hands with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust to invest in new vaccines. Nobody wants to invest in vaccines. It's a very, very high risk proposition. It, I think by their estimates, it takes something like $3 billion to get a vaccine candidate into the market. And if you think of all the vaccines that came into the market earlier for SARS or MERS, by the time the vaccine came, the pandemic was over. And therefore, as a business, if you are developing vaccines, you are taking huge amount of risk, right? Why do we think we got this vaccine so quick? It's because the rich countries started getting affected with COVID, right? If it's the poor countries, there wouldn't have been enough money to develop a vaccine this fast, right? So it took like 10 years for the Ebola vaccine to come in. And so therefore you have to understand that a vaccine development and manufacturing pipeline is not this highly incentivized, seamless thing that's been happening, right? Very few large pharma companies are interested in vaccines, right? Even if people keep talking about Pfizer, it's actually BioNTech that developed the vaccine, right?
Yeah.
Pfizer kind of joined hands. You don't have like many large pharma companies. A lot of neglected diseases, right? So how many new vaccines have we seen coming in? Very few countries interested in vaccines. So therefore, I think if India can't produce enough vaccines, nobody can. I think there is some noise about some ingredients that need to come from some of the Western nations that may be holding back. But I don't see any reason why Serum Institute would want to produce less than what it is able to produce. There are other compounding issues. I think there's been some serious tragedy here in the US with the J&J vaccine. I think they mixed up some ingredients that affected some supply. I think there is another company in India which I think through Quad partnership is producing something like 700, 800 million doses. But again, unfortunately, we are in this scenario where we need more than what we have. Just have to kind of hope that we start making much more, at least as much as we can distribute.
All right. So again, now that we have spoken about diet, so now this live stream has become a diet stream. So did you do a low carb diet to lose weight, Kushal? To be very honest, Mr. Lee, you've asked this question. My diet was very simple. I just started eating less of what I used to eat. So I honestly did not change a lot. I would just eat less, and I would walk 10 to 12,000 steps at that time. And then later on, I'd play some badminton. And then I started doing some weight training and stuff like that. But I really did not do anything else. There's another follow up question from Tanvir. He says, with a BMI of 33, I wear 3 masks. Not good. At a time where I can assume I could even live on Mars, as I could hardly breathe. But other gym goers have contracted COVID twice. So is comorbidity really a correct metric of measure? No. Tanmay, please realize that because you have been masking very well, that is one of the single largest factor that you are protected from COVID. Please do not assume obesity not to be a factor. Obesity is a major factor. So please take that very seriously. Ram, on to you.
Yeah, on the weight loss thing, my simple thing was a classic explore and exploit. What works
Mhm.
for one doesn't work for others. So I started exploring different methods. And when I found the one that works for me, I exploited it. In my case, it was one meal a day. I just eat dinner and that's it, nothing else. Uh, and I don't feel hungry during the day, but that's a longer conversation. On the other question, again, this is a classic thing of risk framing, right? It doesn't mean that just because you're obese, you will get it. Doesn't mean
Mm.
that you're obese, you will get it and you will die. You have a higher risk of, a serious outcome if you get it. So you're no more or no less at risk of getting it. Uh, and it's possible that in some people's case, they might be able to fight off the infection. And again, really good doctors know how to frame it. I'll tell a very, very quick story. My
Sure.
elder son, when he was 2, uh, he had to go through a complicated, surgery on his small intestine, right? So after the surgery happened, the junior surgeon came to me and said, "Hey, there is a 99% chance that it's fine. There is a 1% chance that he may need a corrective surgery, right?" The senior surgeon, who's a brilliant guy, came to me and said, "Let me say that in different words." He said, "Of the 100 surgeries we do, one child needs a corrective surgery. So it does not mean that your son has a 99% chance of not needing a second surgery. Is that he could be in that 1 out of 100, or he could be in the 99 out of 100. And just as luck would have it, my son was one in that 100. He needed a corrective surgery
Hmm.
3 6 months down the line. If I had seen that 99% chance, I would have been very upset when he needed a corrective surgery. But that risk was framed better. So, I mean, of course, nobody wants their child to go through surgery, but at least I didn't curse the doctor for misinforming me. And so, therefore, in this case, I think you have to be careful. Obviously, if you have, comorbidities, but again, I would strongly urge instead of 3 masks, lose the 3 BMI.
Oh
And
yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more with you, Ram. All right, guys. I think we've almost touched the hour and a half mark, so I want to wrap things up. But before I wrap things up, just want to leave a last few comments. First of all, I want to thank Ram for once again coming on the podcast and sharing his views with us. It is always a pleasure, Ram, to talk to you because you tend to explain things far better than I do because you're more calm than I am. I just get excited. So thanks a lot once again.
glad to be here for all those who joined. Thank you for your time. I hope it was worth it.
Okay, guys. So just a few passing comments. Once again, please, if you know someone who is 45 years and above and does not have any major serious condition that disallows them or makes them, not valid to get a vaccination, please encourage people to get a vaccine. Try and understand the vaccines work. So I will frame this in this way. So, there is this famous advertisement that we had, Meri kameez teri kameez se safed hai. So let me tell you why I'm calling this, recalling this ad. So nowadays, you will have this weird kind of, mentions on Twitter and Facebook that, oh, you know what? The Pfizer vaccine efficiency is 94%. You know what? The Moderna vaccine efficiency is 92%. You know what? Covishield is 81%. You know what? Covaxin of Bharat Biotech is 86%. Like I said, this is all Meri kameez, teri kameez se safed hai. Because that, while it matters, should not be our primary concern. You know what matters? What is the mortality rate after you are vaccinated? And what is your chances of developing any morbidity post COVID because of the infection after you catch it? And in those departments, each and every vaccine that has been tested up till now, and the data is very robust till now, that you get almost 98% plus, and in case of mortality, as good as 100% protection. So, you know what? It doesn't matter if you get a Pfizer, doesn't matter if you get a Johnson and Johnson. It doesn't matter. As of now, take the vaccine that is available to you. Once you have a variety of vaccines in the market, then you can get into this discussion of मेरी कमीज तेरी कमीज से सफेद है, मेरे biceps 13 inch हैं, तेरे biceps 11 inch है. Until then, just get what you have. It does not matter. The vaccines are safe. Try and understand that if out of 7 crore Covishield shots in India, if less than 100 people develop blood clots, it is not a serious problem. Do you know your probabilities of dying from COVID are far more than you developing blood clots from getting the vaccine? So try and develop that rationality in you. Look around you. It is our moral responsibility to make sure that more and more people get vaccinated. As far as our company is concerned, the moment the 45 plus category was announced, I made sure everybody in my company gets vaccinated. With most of them, just telling them, look, it's good for you, worked. Well, a couple of people it did not. I said, I'll fire you if you don't get vaccinated. Lo and behold, they got vaccinated then. But I still did not need to use the nuclear option of I'll fire you with most of them. More than 95% of the people who are eligible for the vaccine just took it when I told, look, it's good for you, go and get it. And I just used the doctors not dying analogy. So once again, today's podcast was just to let you understand that numbers can be complicated. Do not fall for clickbait headlines. Every time you see a moronic tweet from a journalist or from an organization that says, well, you got COVID because of the vaccine, it doesn't matter. Look at the severity of the disease, and that's where the reality lies. So please make sure everybody gets vaccinated. I'll end today's podcast on that note, and I'll request all of you to like the video, comment on it, subscribe to the channel. If you can support the podcast, become a member of the channel or support the podcast on Patreon. You can also support the podcast by sending direct donations to the UPI ID and buying the Charvak podcast merch. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste, take care, goodbye.
Bye.